Hello everybody and welcome to Chapter 6 of Katora et al. 2020. Today we're talking about the political environment as a critical concern. In this chapter we begin with learning about the sovereignty of nations, what that means and how it affects the stability of government policies. We're looking at how different government types, political parties, nationalism, target animosity and trade disputes can affect the environment for marketing in foreign countries. We're also looking at the political risks of global business and the factors that affect stability. We consider the importance of the political system to international marketing and its effect on foreign investments. And we look at the impact of political and social activism as well as violence and terrorism on international business. We consider how to assess and reduce the effect of political vulnerability for an organisation, and we end the chapter with how and why governments encourage foreign investment or not. So let's get going. We begin with considering the sovereignty of nations. So sovereignty is about the powers exercised by the state in relation to other countries. And it's important to note that a citizen is subject to the state laws, even outside the country's borders. Nations can and do abridge specific aspects of their sovereign rights for the purposes of coexisting with other nations. We see agreements between geographic blocs, such as the European Union and the USMCA agreement. So the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, previously known as NAFTA, as well as the EU bloc, are examples of agreements between nations who have chosen to give up a degree of their sovereignty for the purposes of facilitating free trade and other benefits. Now, the World Trade Organization plays a prominent and important role in such facilitations. But some countries view the World Trade Organization as a threat to sovereignty because they fear relinquishing their nation's rights for a common goal, especially when it does not benefit them or may even be detrimental to their national goals. So essentially, foreign investment can be viewed as a threat to sovereignty, and these agreements sometimes take many years to negotiate. So when we're talking about the sovereignty of a nation, we're talking about the supreme powers exercised over a country's members, and the characteristics of a sovereign state include full legal equality with other states, independent and freedom from external control. They have the right to govern their own territory, select their own political, economic and social systems, and they also hold the power whether or not to enter into block trade agreements with other nations. So let's look at the stability of government politics as it's important to international marketing. When we look at a political climate, we're recognising that the ideal climate is, of course, a stable and friendly government. This is what's ideal for a multinational firm for the context of international marketing. But as we know, we don't always reach the ideal, and so we need to recognise that there are identifiable causes of instability. Causes such as inherent internal instability, political shifts that happen during elections that, of course, impact trade conditions, nationalism that protects the nation state, policies that protect the nation state, animosity towards specific countries, and trade disputes. This illustration here is a picture that was taken on the first Sunday after the Haiti 2010 earthquake, and we can see that the streets were filled with scavengers. And 10 years on, in 2020, the struggle in Haiti continues. There's been other natural disasters and political instability that have taken place. And currently, there is a call for the Haitian president to step down. I've given you a hyperlink to learn more about that. So now let's consider different forms of government. We can look at a monarchy, such as the UK and the Commonwealth states, or a dictatorship, such as North Korea, where we have rule by one. We can look at an aristocracy, or an oligarchy, where it's ruled by few, such as Russia. Or, in contrast, we can consider a democracy as a different form of government, where the people in power are elected by the community. So effectively, a democracy is about rule by many. And it's important to note that sovereign states mostly have nominally representative governments, and so that translates to universal suffrage. And unfortunately, as is the case potentially with the US, we see some countries backsliding from a democratic government towards an autocracy. Here, we've got a list of different government structures. In Afghanistan, we have Presidential Islamic Republic. In Cuba, we have a communist state. Whereas in the United States, we have a three-tier system of a constitutional federal republic: federal, state, local. City, they call it in the US. Okay, so in considering the stability of government politics, we as international marketers need to understand the philosophies of major political parties within a country. The dominant party will alter attitudes, and policies will change, and so it has an effect on the overall business climate. So international marketers, if they know what's good for them, they'll need to understand the direction each party is likely to take if they should find themselves in power. So we, as astute and effective international marketers, need to understand all aspects of the political landscape and anticipate the potential policy changes, which may well be quite drastic. And the reason we need to do that, we need to do our homework, is because we need to know how to respond. Okay. Here we've got a graphic of an Iranian woman passing in front of an election billboard displaying Iranian's supreme leader who is casting his own vote in Iran. And in Iran, voting is often taking place in a mosque or a school. But what this graphic shows is the contrast of a woman walking past the billboard in the dress that is required and mandated by the government, the power, the authorities, the people in power. So what about nationalism? Nationalism is about national pride and unity. It's about a national interest and security that's more important, considered more important than international relations. So it's a priority on national interest. And it restricts imports and tariffs and other barriers to international trade because they essentially want to encourage domestic trade. What about targeted fear or animosity? Well, targeted animosity is about government policies or anti-trade policies directed towards a particular country, whereas nationalism is about trade policies that are directed generally to all foreign trade. When we're talking about nationalism, what's most important is the national domestic policies and the protection of that. So we see protectionism policies being implemented. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the World Trade Organization plays an important role in international trade negotiations, and specifically with regards to the dispute resolution process. So what are the political risks of global business? Well, goods can be confiscated without payment. They can be expropriated, where the government seizes the investment but makes some reimbursement for the assets. Or we can talk about domestication, where the host country gradually gains control of the investment. And here we're talking about a series of government decrees that mandate local ownership and national involvement of companies' management. So it's part of the deal to trade with a particular country that is focused on domestic trade as more important than foreign trade. When we look at the economic risks of doing foreign trade, we can consider the exchange controls. And this happens when there is a shortage of foreign exchange in the country and government restricts the spending in specific foreign currencies. And that might result in differential exchange rates for different products that are entering the country. We can also recognise local content laws being implemented where all countries and regions have local content laws. For example, NAFTA had 62.5% of local content requirement in international trade. Now, NAFTA has been reinvented as the USMCA, and part of that renegotiation is an increase from 62.5% to 75% of local content requirement for cars that are originating from the US, Mexico, Canada region. And that's a reflection of the current US nationalism policies being put into place. Similarly, in the EU, they have a 45% local content requirement that forces companies to use local components. Other economic risks that we need to consider in doing global business include import restrictions, where countries may impose import restrictions to protect local industries, local farmers, but this actually may be detrimental to the local economy if it interrupts the production in certain industries. Then there's tax controls, where taxes are imposed on foreign companies but not on domestic companies, causing their products to be more expensive in the country because costs are passed on to the consumer. And then there's price controls, where countries impose price controls on foreign companies selling essential products such as food or gasoline. And this especially happens during inflationary periods. Then there's labour problems. Unionism and labour laws are different in different countries, and they're especially strict with regards to dismissing or firing employees by foreign companies. China's labour laws have been revamped and require foreign companies to provide a lot more benefits as well as lifelong employment after a certain number of years of service. Now, the graphic that I've got here refers to local content requirements across specific countries, and you can see that India has a very high requirement with regards to local content laws. USA, as I mentioned, is increasing the local content requirements, and Canada is amongst the lowest. Now, in assessing political risks of global business, nations can also impose sanctions where they boycott or stop trade, and it's possible to boycott or issue sanctions against the trade of specific products. The issue here that history has shown us that sanctions are almost always unsuccessful, and yet they persist. Here we've got a contrast of a new Cherry, or relatively new Cherry vehicle with the red number plate, and on the other picture, it's a picture of a 1957 Chevy with the yellow number plate, yellow registration plate. And this is showing you the US embargo of vehicles into Cuba. There's no new American cars in Cuba, and that is because it's a consequence of the US embargo of American vehicles being imported into Cuba. It's an official ban on trade. So, political and social activism, as well as non-government organisations, also need to be considered when we're assessing the political risks of global business. The impact of political and social activism can interrupt the flow of trade, and political and social activism can be peaceful, but it also can be violent, and regardless may well affect trade negotiations, trade change, trade policies, because that's what it's designed to do. Political and social activists seek to change the behaviour of governments and or corporations. Many focus on the broad issue of globalizations, We have seen many demonstrations over the years against the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And so effectively, the internet and telecommunications systems have become tools or maybe weapons of political and social activism. Non-government organisations also involve themselves in protests by way of lobbying and collaborations with governments. Now, what about terrorism and war even? Well, sometimes what starts out as a peaceful protest may turn violent. We see thousands of terrorism attacks each year, and no country is immune. Multinationals are actually targets for terrorism attacks, and it's embarrassing for governments, and it's embarrassing for the relationships that they have with multinational organisations. Multinationals are sometimes targeted by way of their executives being kidnapped and held to ransom. And there is also the infliction of terror within the country that happens when terrorism attacks occur. Most US attacks have been against businesses, so we need to consider the proximity of the violence and the advice of local and foreign stakeholders when we're assessing the political risks of doing global business. Here we have a picture of the Nairobi slum of Kibera. They are supporters of the opposition leader, and they're tearing up a railway that runs from the coast to Uganda. And in this political disaster in Kenya, there were 12 people killed, and of course the destruction of the railway does much damage to commerce and trade all along the countries in Eastern Africa. Now, we can't forget about cyber terrorism and cybercrime. There's growing potential to use cyber terrorism as a form of violence on a particular country. And it can inflict great harm because we, in the community, as well as organisations involved in global business, are quite dependent on the internet. So if a virus is introduced, it can do much damage before it's remedied. It's very difficult to determine the source of the attack, and the various reasons that happen, the various reasons why cyber terrorism might be an issue is because of espionage, because of political punishment, and potential national security attacks. Some companies are actually more vulnerable than others. With regards to the more vulnerable companies, these are the organisations that are subject to political attention, so high profile, and they may face unpredictable government restrictions, whereas less vulnerable organisations are often high priority for the host country and therefore excused from various taxes, quotas, controls, etc. So, when we're looking to assess political vulnerability, there's no specific formulas to determine product vulnerability, but some generalizations may help. We can look at perceptions with regards to product impact on the environment. We can look at exchange rates and how particular trades are leaving that product sensitive to political attack. We can look at national and economic security, welfare of the community, particularly children, public visibility, the degree of public debate, and perceptions that are associated with the product country of origin may also indicate the political sensitivity of a product. So in the contemporary market, we can see US government suspicions of Chinese telecommunications technology moving into the US market, which have recently, I don't know how to say it, the Huawei telecommunications technology that has now been accepted by the UK and not deemed favourable by that move by the UK, that acceptance by the UK is not deemed favourable by the US market. At a more micro level, we saw a Indian KFC store closed due to health reasons because of 2 flies found in the kitchen, and there were protests for months over that in India, and the protests suggested that foreign investment should be limited to high tech. And a statement put out by one of the farmers leading those protests suggested that India does not need junk food foreign investment. The protesters actually managed to get that store reopened. But public health is often subject of political debate. And we see the EU ban on hormone-treated beef for health safety continuing, but where are those discussions in the US? And part of the justification of these policies that are currently in place is that the World Trade Organization claims that there's no scientific basis for any such ban. So, we need to be able to forecast political risk in order to assess the political vulnerability of an organisation. So firms attempt to predict political instability in a foreign country. They evaluate the influence of politics on international business decisions. They estimate or seek to estimate the level of risk an organisation may well be assuming in investing in a particular region or country. Government failure is a great source of risk because it causes chaos in the streets and the markets. And there is actually a failed state index that we can use as international marketers to help us assess this risk. Here's a list of those countries that are closest to failure, beginning with South Sudan and Somalia at the top of the list. And I'll leave you to browse the list. So, how can political vulnerability be reduced? Well, many believe that, of course, foreign investment may well be self-serving. Some believe that foreign investors exploit a country's wealth at the expense of the domestic population. Relations between governments and multinational corporations are generally positive, however, if the investment improves the country's balance of payments, uses local content, locally produced resources, transfers capital, technology and skills into the domestic market, creates jobs in the domestic market, and makes tax contributions. And then there's also corporate philanthropy as a way to lessen, as a strategy to lessen political vulnerability of an organisation in a foreign market. So let's look at that a little bit more. When we're looking to lessen political vulnerability, we can implement strategies that are designed to reduce political vulnerability and risk. Here's a list of strategies that international marketers may well consider. Joint ventures make an organisation typically less susceptible to political harassment, because joint ventures are about making trade agreements with local organisations or local members, or maybe we might disperse the risk by introducing a third country multinational. And so what we're seeking to do with a joint venture is limit an organisation's financial exposure in a foreign market. And the reason why a joint venture with local organisations or local members helps minimise political vulnerability and risk is because it engenders, or maybe hopefully engenders, or lessens at least, anti-multinational perceptions. And but it's not the only strategy that we can employ. We can look at expanding the investment base, and what we're doing here is including several investors and banks in financing an investment in a host country. This approach, this strategy, has the advantage of engaging the power of the banks whenever any kind of government takeover or harassment is threatened. That works in our favour. So this strategy becomes especially powerful if the banks have made loans to the host country. If the government threatens expropriation or other types of takeovers, the financing bank has substantial power with the government. So it's a way potentially to lessen political vulnerability. Another strategy that we can consider is licensing or franchising. So here we're talking about a strategy where firms basically seek to eliminate all the risks via licensing technology or systems for a fee. And this can be very effective in situations in which the technology is quite unique and the risk is high. Of course, there's some risk assumed because the licensee can refuse to pay the required fees while continuing to use the technology. So these risks have to be assessed and policies need to be put in place to avoid such situation, or at least reduce the risk associated. Now, when we're talking about cases in which a host country is demanding local participation, the most effective long-range solution is planned phasing out, and this is referred to as planned domestication. This approach, this strategy, is not the preferred business practice, but the alternative of government-initiated domestication, and it can be as disastrous as confiscation. A reasonable response to the potential of domestication, planned domestication, can be profitable and operationally expedient for the foreign investor. So planned domestication essentially is a gradual process of participating with the nationals in all phases of the company operations. So then moving on, let's look at political bargaining. This is where multinational organisations engage in lobbying and other sorts of political bargaining to avoid potential political risks. In the case of Mattel, they issued a recall of their Chinese-made toys, saying that the items were defective because of Mattel's design flaws. And this extraordinary apology, essentially, was a surprise, because US companies don't usually do that. They want to blame the faulty manufacturing in China, and instead they blamed the internal design flaws. So why did Mattel do that? Well, because Mattel was protecting the huge value chain investment that they had, and they were recognizing that it was easier to fix design and inspection routines than affect or impact the manufacturing practices in China. So an American firm admitting culpability is why this political bargaining was very unusual. Japanese companies, on the other hand, are known to very much take responsibility for the corporate crises that they face in international relations. Now, the last one on this list is political payoffs. And what we're talking about here is bribery, and it's illegal, and it's definitely not recommended. But it is one way to that some organisations have engaged to deal with political vulnerability. And what they're doing is paying off those in power to intervene on behalf, in the favour of, a multinational corporation. So it can be used to lessen the negative effects of a variety of problems, such as avoiding confiscation, taxes, paying fees to agents, or getting through sales contracts or construction contracts or trade agreements. And what happens in political payoffs is that typically low-ranking officers are paid off and required to do to get a particular commercial agreement through that may otherwise would not get through. And so it definitely raises the question of ethics. So when we see political and economic aid in action, we're seeing a situation where it's a win-win situation. Now, the Japanese government paid for a new highway in Tanzania between key safari tourism areas. And why did they do that? Because they wanted to make foreign tourism in Tanzania more efficient, more comfortable, more profitable for the Tanzania company Kibo. And Kibo is one of the high-profile safari organisations operating in the Tanzania tourism industry. Why did the Japanese do that? Because they're going to make money on that investment by paying for the road and lowering the impact on their vehicles that are traversing that road. They actually facilitated the tourism as well as reduced the wear and tear on their foreign investment, their vehicles. So why may a government encourage foreign investment? Well, because it accelerates or potentially accelerates development of an economy, but governments may encourage as well as discourage foreign investment. And the difference lies in the evaluation of a corporation's contribution to the national interest. Development of a domestic economy is the most important reason to encourage foreign investment, but other reasons may be to create local employment, to transfer technology, to generate export sales, maybe stimulate growth and development of a local industry, as mentioned with the Japanese Kibo investing in the Tanzania highway, or maybe they want to conserve foreign exchange. So for these reasons, a government may well encourage foreign investment. US government and other agencies help international companies worldwide, and the reason that US government agencies are helping or trying to help US companies do business in foreign markets is to not only facilitate foreign trade, but to grow US corporations and the US reach into the rest of the world. So here we've got a list of particular US government agencies that are in place and deliberately facilitate and help US organizations to seek foreign trade opportunities. And we're talking about the Department of Commerce in the US government, the International Trade Administration, the Export-Import Bank, Foreign Credit Insurance Association, Agency for International Development, and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. So, if you're a US organization and you want to extend your reach, you want to implement a market expansion strategy into international markets, this list of US government agencies may well be your first port of call. And there you go, that's Chapter 6. Thanks for your attention. I'll see you in Chapter 7.